Hello and welcome back. This week we're taking on the obnoxious smell in the watermill and talking a little bit about the kiln. We mentioned in previous videos just how bad the smell is. The main cause of the problem is a large amount of pigeon droppings in the kiln. These are on what's left of the grain drying platform and on the ground. With half the kiln roof missing, as the wind blows in, it is directed down over the guano and then blasts into the main section of the watermill. Many of the windows in the mill are completely missing. The wind blows through the kiln and escapes through the mill's windows. The wind on the island is almost constant, so more smell is constantly blown into the mill. While we were cleaning up the ground floor, I found a piece of clear plastic sheet and decided to put it across the main source of airflow from the kiln to the mill before we left for the night. I also managed to use the for sale sign to reinforce the plastic. Looking back at the footage as we edit, it's still crazy to see the sign and be reminded we actually bought this mill. The force of the wind on the plastic was so great I had to jam some timber in behind it to make it stay put. The next morning, the gagging smell was barely detectable. Closing up just one of the openings made a huge difference. I was so amazed at the difference, I changed my priority for the day from boarding up the windows to boarding up the kiln. The previous owners made the opening eye roughly closed up. Making any changes or holes in the structure of a historic building without permission is a criminal offence. Unfortunately, the offence now falls to us as the new owners. We need to get retrospective consent or return the building back to its previous state. We are planning to turn this beautiful stone arch into a walkway through to the kiln, which hopefully will be approved by the council and rectify the previous changes that were made. We made the council's planning and building control departments aware of the changes to the building and took advice from them while we were purchasing the property. The plastic piece covering the opening certainly helped, but needed something more air and moisture proof. The roughly shaped opening wasn't particularly well suited to framing, but I managed to find a pickaxe with a broken handle among the mess. The broken handle, combined with the slightly cramped opening, made it a bit awkward to work. I managed to get the corners cleaned up enough to start cutting random bits of timber from around the mill to size. We tried to get some construction lumber from the main island, but it was too long to fit in the van of the person who helped us get our OSB sheets over to the mill. We haven't even really made a start on the mill, and the logistics of being on a small island are already causing problems. Despite bringing a carload of tools and cameras with us, I didn't have a single pencil or pen. I had to make do with using a screwdriver or knife to mark out all my cuts. I used damp-proof membrane behind the framing while covering the opening. You can see how much the wind is constantly blowing on it, despite the other materials blocking the majority of the hole. The opening is smashed into a concrete block chimney. This made it possible to use my nail gun to drive some nails through the timber and into the concrete enough to secure the frame in place, without damaging the historic stonework. Finally, I covered the opening with a sheet of OSB, then wrapped the damp-proof membrane around again. The major source of smell was now fully sealed, but we have more openings to the kiln. On the ground floor, there is also a doorway to the kiln on the left and an opening on the right. I'm not sure what the purpose of the right side opening would have been. The door to the kiln is in pretty bad condition. The frame against the exterior wall is almost completely rotten, and rats have eaten through the bottom right of the door. I didn't want to block it up with something that would have been difficult to remove when we came to start work on the kiln, so I opted to just staple membrane across the doorway from the inside of the kiln. There's also an opening in the stonework above the doorway, which has lots of air moving through it. I nailed a piece of OSB to the top of the door frame to hold the damp-proof membrane against the opening on the kiln side. I thought the Milwaukee staple gun was a bit of a luxury purchase before heading up to the mill, but it proved its worth during the initial trip. To secure the door against the wind blowing it open, I used long screws rather than a nail gun. It's less fun, but it makes it easier to open when we need to. Finally, I put an offcut of OSB across the bottom rat hole. The other opening on the ground floor should have been the easiest of all the openings. It's just a simple rectangular-ish hole. What was a real challenge though was wood to frame the opening with. I was initially trying with some wood that was in the mill. There were so many random nails and screws in it that it made using it pretty impossible. I was able to buy some 6x2 pieces ripped down the middle from someone else on the island, which let me get on with the job. In the comments of previous videos, some people were not sure what a kiln is used for in a mill. You might be more familiar with the idea of a kiln from something like pottery. When grain is harvested, it still has a fairly high moisture content, so it won't grind well. If you tried to grind the grain as harvested, it would likely end up more as a mash than a powder. When the mill was first built, it only had a small kiln. In the 1700s, most farmers on the island had their own grain drying kilns. They would have brought their dried grain to the mill for milling. By the mid-1800s, this practice was changing, and the mill's kiln was extended to the size it is today. At the bottom of the kiln is a firebox. The drying floor was at about the height of the top floor of the mill. The heat from the fire would rise up and dry the grain, which would have been spread across the floor. The moist air would continue up through the vent in the kiln roof. The supports and drying floor in our mill are cast iron, though these likely would have originally been wooden. In the late 1930s, the kiln caught fire in places it wasn't meant to. Thankfully, the whole mill did not burn down. Mill fires are not particularly uncommon. This fire is the reason we have asbestos tiles on the roof, as these were used as replacements for the original slates. The internals of the kiln were likely upgraded to iron at this time, and the new concrete hopper-shaped internals were cast. We have no idea how we're going to remove the concrete and stone internals of the kiln. The concrete is broken, cracked, and collapsing. Thankfully, it isn't pushing the exterior walls out as we have seen in other mills. If you have any suggestions on how we should go about removing the kiln internals, please leave a comment. We still have a couple more openings to the kiln. On the middle floor, there are chutes which, while they have been mostly eaten by beetles, are still mostly airtight. On the top floor is a more substantial opening in what looks to have been a doorway to the drying floor. It has been blocked up with concrete blocks, probably as part of the 1980s renovations. My timber just happens to almost be the right size to fit between the concrete blocks and iron door frame. Along with forgetting a panel pencil, I also didn't bring a hammer. I have a nail gun and an impact driver after all. What would I need a hammer for? I tried using the nail gun as a hammer, but I didn't really want to damage this very expensive tool. This brick is really awkward, but seems to work well enough. The pipe is a soil pipe from the 1980s, so I decided to just work around it. With the top floor opening now closed off, the kiln is completely isolated from the main building. The stone wall between the kiln and the mill is 800mm thick, similar to the exterior walls. In next week's episode, we're going to board up the windows to the mill and talk about our plans for the renovation. If you haven't already done so, I hope you'll consider subscribing to follow along with the project and watch our progress in giving new life to the watermill. We really love reading your comments, so please feel free to ask any questions or make any suggestions you might have, especially for dealing with the kiln internals.